Okay.
Latin America. We are thrilled to have 4 presenters here with us, 2 economists and 2 sociologists, to discuss this topic. In this session, we want to explore how perceptions, attitudes, preferences, and beliefs hinder social mobility and redistribution in the region, a highly unequal one, as we already know. Each presenter will have 20 minutes for presentation. I will introduce each of you as you speak, and I will also control the time, and then after that we will have additional time for discussion and for questions with the audience and everything. So we're very happy to have all of you here. Welcome. So first we will have Leopoldo Ferguson. Leopoldo is a professor in economics and co-director of the TRIS initiative in Uniades, Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT and has been a visiting professor at Harvard University, MIT, the University of Chicago, the University of Barcelona, and CENFI, among others. His research focuses on political economy and economic development with studies on the political determinants of state capacity, the political economy of media, and more recently, the cultural dimensions of inequality. Welcome, Leopoldo. We are ready.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thanks everyone for coming to the session. I'm really thrilled to be part of it. Is it okay if I stand up? Okay, I feel all constrained if I don't. That's better. Can I have that? Okay, excellent. So the paper that I'm going to share with you today is joined with Natalia Garbiras Diaz, who is at Harvard Business School, and Michael Weintraub, who is a colleague at Universidad de los Andes. I also want to thank our great RAs listed there, Hernán Carvajal and Jorge Luis Ochea, and our funders also listed there. And, I'm going to talk about the importance of accents and give you some experimental evidence from Colombia. And I think that the motivation, at least in this audience, should be pretty direct. The way that we speak and we pronounce our language is a powerful signal of our particular background, and that can be our national origin, our regional origin, our ethnic outlook, our generation, our gender, and the dimension that we're going to care about in here, the socioeconomic background that we have. And not only it tells us something, it also leads to differential treatment. This can be dramatic and very early on. There's work showing that even very young children, 5-year-olds, are able not only to prefer people of the same race, but also of the same accent. And in some cases, the accent preference trumps the race preference. So it's a really strong thing. And there's a long tradition of studying the class-based variation in accents. I'm citing here just a couple of references. One example is Labov's classical study of the R sound in New York, going to fancy stores and to not so fancy stores, and noting how the fancy stores have one form of pronouncing the R, and the not so fancy another form of pronouncing the R. And moreover, when you entice a person to say again a word that you weren't able to understand, you would move into the highest status R sound. So it's not only that there are differences, there is a status associated with the different ways in which we pronounce words. And of course, also another classical example is the UK, where the received pronunciation of the Queen's English is the one that was used officially in the BBC for years, and is perceived as the one that is correct and of highest status. And this can have consequences for many things, among others for the economy. And there's here, I'm just citing one meta-analysis suggesting the effects of this on the labor market and how different accents can open or close doors in the labor market. Now, our question is basically to look at how accents affect interpersonal relations and societal views. We believe that they do matter for many reasons, but essentially they are daily reminders of the gaps between socioeconomic groups, the relative status between those groups, and the fact that those differences, those gaps, translate not only to differences in income, but to differences into hard to change differences like cultural and social resources that you grew up with and you might not be able to or want to change. So in this case, ultimately class-based accents can be capital in the sense that they can not only reflect class, but they can also reinforce class. Now the issue is that there's a huge empirical problem. Is this really what's going on, or do class-based accents matter because they convey differences in other correlated issues, and in particular in this paper we're going to focus on income and education, which are two correlated forms of capital, if you want to say. So, is it that if I have a high-class accent or a low-class accent, I am treated differentially because that accent is telling my interlocutor what's the income or the education that I have, or is there something else? That's the effort that we're going to try to do in this paper. We'll try to unbundle those effects. I will have some pink titles here, which are just titles that in the interest of time in a short presentation, I will have to just glance through and show you the little taste of the content. I'll be happy to discuss more in the Q&A. And sadly, one of the things that I have to just go through without giving or doing sufficient justice is the existing literature in this, which is a vast literature on several disciplines. Certainly economists have paid particularly little attention to these issues compared to sociologists, sociolinguistics, and so on. And really the contribution that we're bringing here is not so much the conceptualization, which is pretty rich in these disciplines, is really this effort to unbundle whether the effect of accent comes for something other than a very important correlated set of traits, which is, in particular income and education, as I said. And that is important for a bunch of reasons that I'm going to get back to by the end of the talk. So what's the research design that we are going to share with you today? So essentially what we did is we implemented an experimental survey in Bogota, in which we recruited a sample of participants from all socioeconomic backgrounds in the city. And we sent half of the people to an experimental module that had kind of our baseline treatment. And our baseline treatment was one in which people had to choose between two different potential profiles. And these profiles included person I and person B, who had certain level of income, certain level of education, certain level of work experience, and they would describe themselves and they would talk about their most important personality trait, for which we relied on the Big Five personality scheme used by psychologists, and they described this in the first person, so you could hear their accent. And the accent could be either high class or low class. So this is a conjoint experiment in which you have to choose between person A and person B for a number of different questions. Who is likely to be a best friend or best for business, or who could be your boss, things like that. Now, in another set of conjoint experiments, we left out part of the information so that we could do the mechanisms analysis. Is it that accents matter because of education and income or something else? Well, if I leave the education and income information aside, I can test the extent to which accent is used as a proxy for education and income when I see it, or if it matters independently. So that's the role of this set of experiments. And finally, 10% of the sample was used for another experiment embedded into the survey, which is some people were not hearing class-based accents at all. They were just seeing all the information in text form. So we were not being reminded that there is this difference in the way we speak based on our socioeconomic background. And so they serve as a good control to see whether being exposed to these differences in accents that transmit these gaps in socioeconomic groups in the population change your society, so your views about society. And in particular, we will ask about beliefs in meritocracy, trust towards strangers or people close to me, belief in inequality as a big problem in society or not. So just for you to get a sense, people would get into their devices and they would find in the standard thing something like this. They would have to listen to the audios. They couldn't go forward until they had listened to this. And the audios were first-person descriptions of my main personality trait, as I said, in either a high-class accent or a low-class accent. In Bogota, that's colloquially known as gomelo or lleno. And then you would know the personal income, the education level, and the work experience. And the ones who were used as the control condition to be able to see if this created any changes in societal views would have all the information in text form. Okay, now what we do then with this is we apply standard conjoint experiment analysis, which essentially allows one, after I have done many of these choices, I can infer how much do I prefer a person as a result of the level of education that they have, or as a result of the level of income, or as a result of the level of high or low class accent that they exhibit. There's one thing that we were careful about, which is that we randomize these attributes in a realistic manner so that they could have external validity. It would seem odd to have someone who is super rich but very low education. So that person comes up with a very low probability, with the probability that actually shows up in Colombian household surveys. So that way we get not simply the average marginal component effect, but a more realistic estimate, which is the population average marginal component effect. Okay. And since it's an experiment, it's very simple. We can see the effect of any attribute, but we're going to focus on the effect of the high class accent relative to the low class accent. For you to know some things about how we measure the accent. So one thing is that we avoided class neutral accent. And this may be kind of obvious ex post, but we kind of toyed with that for a bit. But soon enough, we learned that there's no such thing as a neutral accent. And also, if there's something where it's not neutral, but you are able to obscure your class origin a bit more, it may be interpreted as you're being more professional so that you are not showing which socioeconomic group you're coming from. So that's why everything that I'm going to say here that we had when writing those scripts, or actually recording these scripts. So the first one is that this was done by actors who read the script with a high class or a low class accent. We used pitch modifying software to create subtle differences in the audio pitches, very, very subtle, not very big. So that, you wouldn't feel that the same person was talking to you over and over again. Something that is very useful of doing this in a survey setting is that you don't see how the person is dressed, or how they are speaking, or how they're moving their hands. We're really able to keep everything constant and only moving the accent. And in fact, we ask the actors not to change the scripts in any way, or to use any kind of, or spaces of silence. Everything should be similar except for the high or low class accent. And so with that, the first thing that we did is that for a separate set of people, we ran a survey to see whether people could predict class based on accents. And the first one is a very direct question of who do you think this voice corresponds to a high class or a low class person? And you can see here that Bogotanos, classifying Bogotanos, are very successful at doing that. And the second, third, and fourth columns are actually not about which class do you think the person belongs to, but which kind of music do you think they like, which kind of leisurely activities do you think they do, and which kind of sport do you think they practice. And we choose sports that are more typical of the higher classes or the lower classes. So whether it is with respect to these kind of cultural attributes or social class as a concept, the high class accent indeed correlates, or the actors did a good job. Now, one thing that I want to say is that we did this also for Chile, and Chileans are also very good at classifying Chileans. But when we ask Bogotanos to classify Chileans, they have no clues whether the Chileans are high class or low class. And I'm going to come back to why we did this towards the end of the talk. Now, I mentioned that one of the important things that we want to do is to try to unbundle the effect of class-based accents, and to learn whether they simply reflect correlated forms of capital or they matter for additional reasons. And for that, you can think of us having two kind of arms. There's one which is called the inferred income arm, where I didn't show the income of the hypothetical profile. So I have to infer it. I have to learn what's the income based on the other characteristics, education, and in particular the accent. Then there's the other one, which is the manipulated income acting, which I have given the person what's the level of income, and say, for instance, I can think here of, I've told them that this is a high income person. Now think of reading through the columns. When I do the inferred income arm, the difference in outcomes, say, who do I prefer as a friend, is what we can call the total effect. whereas the difference at a given level of income is what we're going to call the average control direct effect. It's the effect of accent that cannot come from income because this is fixing income at a given level. And the difference is what we're going to call the eliminated effect, which tells us about the causal mechanisms. If there is something in this difference, then the total effect partly reflects causal mechanisms, things of the sort, when I didn't have the income, then I used the accent to learn the income to then infer how do I care about income for the outcome, okay? Or it could be causal interactions. At different levels of incomes, different accents matter differently, okay? So that's going to be the eliminated effect. And what is going to be my main concern when I look at the mechanisms analysis, it's going to see whether when I look at the average control direct effect, there is still an important effect even when I fix income and education. In that case, accents matter beyond income and education. Okay, so the results are pretty standard to show. I had a clock here, but now, okay, I'm good. The results are pretty quick to reveal and are pretty stark, so this is going to go fast, but you're going to get the gist of it very easily. Okay, perfect. Yeah, but I have several things to show. So I'm going to use up those 5 minutes for sure. So you can see here that the first set of outcomes are going to be personal relationship. Who do you think is more able to step into others' shoes? Who is more empathic? Who do you prefer as being, or who do you believe could be more trustworthy? Who could you prefer as a friend? And then the next ones are going to be about labor outcomes. Who is preferable to do business with? Who do you think is more likely to share your workplace or you prefer to share the workplace with? Who is more likely to be your boss? And there was another one in which we gave them a letter, and the letter was offering this juicy job and says, like, who do you think is more likely to receive this letter? And in all of them, you can see for income and education the effects, but really, since we're focused on accent, focus on here, there's always a high-class accent premium. People believe that people with a high-class accent are more empathic, are more trustworthy, are better as friends, are better to have as partners in the job or businesses, are more likely to be your bosses, and are more likely to receive a juicy job offer. So there is a high-class accent premium in interpersonal relationships and in the job market. Okay. Now, one thing that we weren't expecting was, okay, there's going to be a high-class accent premium, but there's also going to be an in-group preferences. So if I am low-class accent, I might kind of be hesitant to trust someone who is high-class accent. So we were expecting to see this high-class premium to be mitigated somehow if the subject, the person responding to the survey, was low-class. And we didn't find that. So what you see here is that the interaction of the class-based high accent and whether the person is of low socioeconomic status is very precisely estimated at 0. So this has been around in the culture in so many ways that even people who are of low socioeconomic status tend to favor this high-class accent. Okay. This one is pink, but it's fun. Well, if I have time, I'll come back to it. Now, the other treatment that we did, as I mentioned, is these downstream effects, which is some people didn't listen to the accents. They just saw textual information. Some people were therefore reminded of these gaps that are not just in the level of income, but are actually in the ways we speak. So they transmit to these kind of cultural features that we have. And so here what we do, we thought when we did this, well, this is a long shot, but let's do it in any case. Because, it's just simply like a small priming of accents that you hear in the street in any case every day. Now, even though this was a pretty subtle treatment, what you can see here is that two things change. The first one is in this table, which is this index of familism tells you the relative trust that you have towards people who are close to you relative to people who are far away from you. And that increases. So you become more trustworthy of people close relative to the people far from you, or if you want to put it the other way, you become less trustful of people who are distant to you, which is consistent to being reminded of the gaps that there are out there in society. So someone who I don't know, it might be someone who I don't trust. Now, the other thing that we found is also an acid test. If you ask in Latin America what are the most important problems of the country, you're going to surely find that most people would say insecurity and corruption. That's what comes out survey by survey. We added a few other options. We added inequality and unemployment, and the share of people choosing inequality increased when they had listened to these class-based accents. So this does make more salient the fact that there are these big gaps in society. Now, on causal mechanisms, I could delve on many details here, but remember that the most important thing that I wanted to look at is whether, even after controlling for a level of income and education, there's still an effect of the accent. And for that, you have to see the lower estimate in each of the graphs. And it's not only that there's always there, it's sometimes even bigger. So it is not that accents are mattering because they transmit information about income and education. They matter for their own sake. And this, happens for all the outcomes that we have. I'm gonna skip this is pink. Now, how can we interpret this? There are many different ways to interpret this, but of course, the one that we think at least plays an important role is the fact that beyond the income and education, when society is not only unequal, but it's segregated and you spend time with different people, then you have friends that are different if you are rich or poor. You have ways of behaving that are different if you are rich or poor. You have preferences that are different if they are rich or poor. And those friends, preferences, and ways of behaving have some status attached to it and have a consequence in interaction in the labor market and so forth. And in fact, that interpretation is consistent with the fact that the high class accent not only predicts class, but also predicts these cultural features like which type of sports do you like, which type of music do you listen to, and so forth. Of course, we cannot rule out that there's something else. We only could rule out that it's not just income and education. There could be any other things. We just think that this certainly must play a role. Someone could say, well, could it be also race? Well, at least in the case of Bogota, there's not a strong correlation between race and social class. Could it be wealth? Well, income and wealth in Colombia is very strongly correlated, but so by controlling for income, we're largely controlling for wealth. It could be other desirable attributes, but if there are some of these desirable attributes, so first reason why we use Chile, they have to be attributes that do not travel across borders among those peoples with high classes. Because remember that Bogotanos had no clue who was high class if they were not culturally codified like the Bogotanos and from the Chileans. Okay. Now, the final thing, and so I think I'm going to make it on time, is that, as I showed you before, we also had some of the profiles with a high class and a low class Chilean accent. And I showed you that Bogotanos weren't able to predict the class. Consistent with not being able to predict the class, in these set of regressions, you have here the high class accent effect, and then you have here the high class accent effect interacted with a dummy that tells you whether you are actually judging a high class Chilean, not a high class Bogotano. And you can see that these two coefficients are typically of opposite sign and of very similar magnitude. In fact, when we test the null hypothesis of the sum of these coefficients being 0, we cannot reject it. So that is two messages. One, this confirms the fact that this is culturally codified and it's not something that every people from a high class status is able to convey through their manner of speech, certain confidence or something like that. It's not that. But two, this also speaks to the nature of migration because, we have focused so much on migration as being something culturally costly. But also, if you are a lower class individual in Latin America, maybe one of the reasons why you like to go to New York is because people in New York are not going to tell so easily that you are low class. Conversely, high class people in Latin America, if they go to New York, they really have to show another signal to convey that they are high class. So that speaks to this song by Prisioneros of ¿Por qué no se van? Well, maybe because their accent is not well interpreted abroad. Okay, so taking stock, I'm not going to summarize this. The one thing that I'm going to say is just, this I think is very relevant for a number of reasons, but one of them is that, I think, of course, social class is a bundle. I am making an analytical effort here to unbundle, but the unbundling is important because at least as economists, we often only focus on the fact that we have to, give out cash transfers or something like that. But this speaks to something beyond differences in money. And so we have to think, what are the policies that are able to counteract this? So going back to the BBC, one thing that the BBC did was stop only broadcasting with the received pronunciation, but broadcasting with regional accent, with class accents. And so this, forces a debate on those issues. And I'm going to stop there because I think I've just hit my time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leopoldo. We will proceed with the presentations and then questions and discussion at the end. Our next presenter is Aurora Ramirez from El Colegio de México. She is a professor at the Center of Economic Studies. In this institution, she holds a PhD in economics from Brown University and has policy experience from working at the IDB, the Mexican Ministry of Economy, and the Ministry of Finance. Her areas of expertise include economic development, applied microeconomics, and political economy. Welcome, Aurora. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Laura, for your presentation, and thanks everyone for coming here. I'm going to present this project, which we have titled Redistribution, Understanding Inequality to Achieve a New Social Contract. This is a joint project with two colleagues, also from Colmex, one from the Center of Economic Studies, Raimundo Campos, who is here, I think, and right there, and Alice Crosser from the Center of Economic Studies, which is also in this panel. And this project is basically studies tax perceptions and demand for redistribution. And basically, its main objective is to turn into a book to try to make this body of literature accessible to a broader audience. As I was telling you, we are a team of sociologists and economists. So in this book, we will try to use a multidisciplinary approach to understand both tax perceptions and demand for redistribution. From economics, we are going to borrow a theoretical framework to understand the implications of different models. For example, implications of how economic inequality shapes demand for redistribution, or for example, how evasion shapes demand for redistribution, and whether evasion from the poor or the rich shapes differently the tax rate you are willing to pay. And from economic and fiscal sociology, we are going to try to understand the interconnections of these perceptions within society, culture, and politics. And for example, understand if different countries, for example, Chile versus Mexico, have different perceptions, for example, on whether the poor should earn less or whether the poor should earn more, and how this shapes the demand for redistribution. And we think this studying these topics is crucial given the high levels of inequality in Mexico and at the same time the low levels of social mobility, which make almost impossible for poor people to go into a higher decile or a higher quintile. And at the same time that there is like this high levels of inequality and social mobility, we have a very low tax burden. So this highlights the importance of understanding tax determinants and moving towards a more progressive tax policy. So we are going to study, as I was telling you in this book, perceptions of taxes. Economic theory usually assumes that people decide to pay taxes only balancing the benefits versus the costs. However, economic rationality shows that people question the state regarding the level of taxes, which taxes are applied, that is, whether the taxes are on consumption, whether the taxes are on income, on wealth, etc., and who bears the tax burden. In this book, we are going to study these questions. Taxes represent the relationship between citizens and the state, so we think that understanding public perceptions of tax payment is crucial for any tax policy to be successful. One of the cases that is recent is the political conflict in France, for example, when they tried to levy a tax on gasoline. So understanding what are the determinants of the desire to pay taxes is important in order to raise or have a more progressive tax policy. So we think that studying perception of taxes is highly relevant because most research has focused on perceptions of public spending. So in this book, we are going to study tax perceptions. And in terms of perceptions of demand for redistribution, what we define by redistribution? Well, the state collect taxes and make transfers, and the allocation of resources before and after this process, we call them redistribution. And what do we call demand for redistribution? Demand for redistribution refers to the desire for how much taxation should exist, who should bear the tax burden, how the burden is distributed across social classes, how these resources should be directed towards society. We will see later that in Mexico we have a very low redistributive policy, and we think that more studies are needed on how society perceives the fairness of the tax levels and distributed justice regarding who pays more in taxes. So let's start with the data that we have for this book. We are going to use public data from various sources, from the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, from the SEI, from the Ministry of Finance, from the World Value Surveys, from Latinobarómetro, from the OECD. But most importantly, we are going to make our own surveys. We have two particular surveys. One is the survey on perceptions of inequality, social mobility, and preferences for redistribution. This survey is unique in Mexico. And we also have a survey on tax perceptions, which is also unique in Mexico. I'm going to show you very briefly about the first and second survey. This survey measures perceptions and desired distributions in inequality, social mobility, as well as support for redistributed policies. In this survey, we have a sample size of around 2,500 individuals from all the regions in Mexico. It is representative of the metropolitan areas with more than 100,000 individuals, and the collection period is from April to May of 2019. In the second survey, we measure people's perceptions regarding public preferences on taxes. It has a sample size of 3,200 individuals, also from all the regions in Mexico, and is also representative of metropolitan areas with more than 100,000 individuals, and the data collection period is from May to June of 2021. And I'm going to show you some of the results of these surveys in this presentation. So inequality and social mobility. First, starting with the context, inequality in Mexico is very high. As you can see, let me see if you can see here, here in this graph, I show you the evolution of inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. As we can see, from 1984 to 1994, inequality raised. Then it decreased from 1994 to 212. This more or less after the NAFTA. And then here we have a decrease in inequality the last several years. Although inequality has decreased in the last years, it's still very high. In fact, surveys show that if you account for the underrepresentation of income in the top level of the distribution of income, the inequality levels are in Mexico raised from 0.5 of the Gini coefficient to almost 0.7. At the same time, social mobility is very low. In fact, this is particularly pronounced at the extremes of the distribution. Here I have a matrix that shows social status mobility, the social status mobility matrix, and as we can see, from the people that is born in the first quintile, 47% remain in the first quintile, and from the people born in the fifth quintile, 54% remain in the fifth quintile. This is starking. But what about perceived and desired inequality and perceived and desired social mobility? Here we are going to, with our surveys, we are going to be able to compare objective data with perceptions. So here what we are plotting is perceived inequality and desired inequality in the orange bars. Perceived inequality is at the green bars, and we can see, for example, that at least 75% of the people perceived a Gini coefficient which is of 0.53. The objective measure of Gini, as I was telling you, is of 0.5. So it's very close to the measured level. As I was telling you, this level is of around 0.7 when you account for the top coding of the upper levels of the distribution. And in terms of desired inequality, when you ask people about what level of distribution they desired, we can see that 25% of the people desire an egalitarian distribution. If you take this average, you see that the level of Gini that Mexicans desire is of around 0.31, which is the level of Gini that exists in France. So people perceived actual levels of inequality very much like the objective measures. However, that they desire a more egalitarian society. Now we are going to see that if they are willing to pay taxes, we are going to see that they not. Let's see this. In terms of social mobility, individuals are going to overestimate the degree of social mobility at the extremes of the distribution. Here I am showing you perceived social mobility and desired social mobility. Perceived are the green bars and desired are the orange bars. And we can see, for example, about like upper mobility, like that people born in the first quintile people perceived that around 36% of people born in the first quintile moved to the fifth quintile. In reality, only 2.6% people born in the first quintile moved to the fifth quintile. So they greatly overestimate upward mobility. In terms of downward mobility, which is here, people perceive that people born in that from people born in the fifth quintile, 31% is going to move to the first quintile. That is going to move from top to bottom. In reality, this figure is 2%. So they overestimate upward and downward mobility. So taxes, what about taxes? Do people want to pay taxes? Well, let's see. First, we're going to see some context. Tax burden in Mexico. Mexico's tax burden is low by international standards. We, in fact, have a tax burden of around 70.9% of GDP. This contrasts with the Latin American average, which is of around, is more than 20%, and the OECD average, which is of around 33%. So we have a very low tax burden, and there's a lot of margin to increase taxes. And at the same time, taxes in Mexico have a limited impact on reducing inequality. Here I am showing you, these are deciles in Mexico, and this shows the height of the bar, shows how much of the income the first decile earns. So here, as we can see, for example, the first decile earns around 2.5% of the income, of the total income in Mexico, and after taxes, this raises only one percentage point. That is, taxes do not do much to change the actual distribution of income. If you see that the top decile around before taxes, the top decile earns more than 30% of the income, and after taxes, this bar only changes height 1.3 percentage points. So, in conclusion, taxes change marginally the income distribution. There's a lot to do in terms of having a more progressive tax policy. What about tax perceptions? Well, support for raising taxes is relatively low. However, we are going to see that it's significantly higher for increasing taxes on high-income groups. Here, for example, look at the taxes on the rich, which are the green bars. We can see that support for tax increases on the income tax for the very rich is around 30%. Support for the corporate income tax is around also 30%, but support for the taxes for the general population are on average 7%. So people do not want more taxes on the general population, but they are willing to support taxes for the richest people. An exception is our taxes on alcohol and tobacco, which mean that maybe they conclude that alcohol and tobacco have some damaging effects on health. In terms of support for introducing new tax, we have a similar behavior. We have two types of taxes in our survey. We ask people to rank taxes based on a general tax or a tax if it is levied over a certain amount of money. For example, here, a general tax, which is a tax in vehicle ownership, which is the orange bar, or whether the tax is only of vehicle ownership if the car is above 200,000 pesos, for example, right? The green bar is for the orange bars are for the general population, and the green bars are for the rich people. And as we can see, people support much more taxes for the rich people, but do not support taxes for the general population. And the tax that has the highest support is the temporary wealth tax, which is only for the very rich, which has a support of almost 60%. Finally, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. Finally, about the determinants of paying more taxes, here I am showing you the results, well, the coefficients of a regression on evasion and other tax determinants. For example, how much confidence in the government you have, the concern for inequality, and much more determinants. They are correlations, just to be clear. But what I am showing you in the graph is what happens if evasion of the poor increases by 1% to the support for introducing new taxes. And each line is a different tax, okay? So for example, what we can see here is that 1 percentage point more of evasion of the very rich increases support for any tax in around 0.3 percentage points. But what happens with evasion on the poor? A 1 percentage point of evasion of the poor decreases support for almost all taxes in around 0.2 percentage points. That is, you are willing to support the introduction of taxes or increasing the existing ones if the evasion of the rich increases. But if the evasion of the poor increases, you are not willing to support the introduction of new taxes. That is, it seems that you punish the class that is not complying with paying taxes. So in conclusion, our book is going to study tax perceptions, and it's going to show that perceptions is relevant for designing successful tax and redistributive policies, particularly in a society such as Mexico, which has high levels of inequality and low levels of social mobility. So using information from the surveys we conducted, we obtained several findings regarding the perceptions of the Mexican population, that is, levels of inequality like those observed are perceived. This is similar to other Latin American countries. Moreover, individuals will prefer a more equal distribution, but they are not willing to pay for more taxes. In the case of perceptions of social mobility, we see that individuals overestimate the degree of mobility at the extremes of the distribution, and that also we see that while the population desires a more equal income distribution, individuals generally oppose higher taxes However, there is greater acceptance for taxing the rich. And perceived tax evasion has a significant impact on tax support. Specifically, increased evasion by the rich and very rich raises support for taxes. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurora. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Alice Crosser. Alice is a professor at the Center of Sociological Studies at El Colegio de México, where she studies elites, perceptions, and social inequalities. She holds a PhD in development studies from Cambridge University and has been a visiting researcher at the University of Oxford, Stanford University, Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and CEPAL. Welcome, Alice. Thank you for participating in this session, and go ahead.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be on this lovely panel. I will not present you with a presentation because I'm focusing on a narrative, so I'll read it to you, so you can listen to the story behind the study that I'm presenting, which I conducted with Aurora and Raimundo Campos and Natalia Torres. It's a follow-up of the project that was presented by Aurora. And we entitled this sub-project, Governing Inequality. It's about tax perceptions, redistributive preferences, and expectations of the state among political elites in Mexico. We explore in this study one of the reasons why high inequality doesn't always lead to redistribution. And rather than focusing on the demand of redistribution, which is what Aurora was talking about, and which is often supposed to translate semi-automatically into its actual provision, we, in this study, look at the supply. That is why political elites are wary of progressive tax reform, and in a sense, they govern inequality rather than redistributing. We highlight in the study how political elites detached from their constituents' realities and their needs feel, quotation, powerless to effect change, see very little urgency for tax reform, and favor enhancing spending efficiency instead. For our purpose, we define political elites as individuals that hold the highest ranking positions within the most relevant institutions for the design or implementation of tax and monetary policy. So these are like the ministries of finance, the Bank of Mexico, etc. And we interviewed 14 of those senior politicians and civil servants at the national, state, and municipal levels about their views on inequality, on redistribution, and the interconnection of these two. And we can talk about methodological details later if you're interested, but the interviews lasted on average for an hour, some much longer, and they were all recorded and transcribed. So about the motivation for this study, let me just tell you that, as Aurora already mentioned, and you probably know, despite tremendous inequality, Mexico has not implemented a comprehensive fiscal reform to mitigate economic disparities and to support a broader welfare system. Although many theories suggest why higher inequality doesn't always lead to greater demands for redistribution, how the rational models a la Meltzer and Richard would predict, the reasons behind the lack of redistributive policy supply are little understood. And specifically, it's unclear why those that are or that have the power to enact progressive tax system have not done so, considering the extent of extreme inequality in countries like Mexico. Research has explored how wealthy individuals affect policymaking and how particular tax policy and the redistributive effects, preferences of economic elites affect these. And Jorge is probably going to talk about this in a second. However, the insights into political elites' view on inequality and their impact on tax reform are somewhat limited. And in this study, we focus on, as I said, the narratives of political elites mobilizing for not promoting fiscal redistribution. So some context, Mexico's economic inequality adjusted to national accounts goes up to a Gini of about 0.7, so it's very high. Social mobility is extremely low. Aurora already mentioned that 3/4 of those born in the lowest quintile remain impoverished throughout their life. But additionally, wealth concentration at the top is exceptionally high, and top politicians and bureaucrats in the country are among those highest earners. Despite these issues, and despite the potential of fiscal redistribution to ameliorate these problems, Mexico's tax to GDP ratio is only about 18%, and that is the lowest among OECD and among the lowest in Latin American countries. And there's also no significant move towards a tax reform or progressive, especially tax reform, not under AMLO and so far not under the new President Sheinbaum either. About 45% of tax revenue is derived from direct taxes, but no federal wealth tax exists, and the income tax system features only 5 brackets with a top rate of 37%. High-income individuals contribute often much below this nominal rate, and there's considerable tax evasion and tax forgiveness for major contributors. At the same time, the provision of government services in Mexico is fragmented and is incomplete, and these conditions, so severe inequality, low tax rates, wealthy political perspectives. The majority considers government spending to be largely inefficient and wants improvement in spending practices. So the government should earn the right to collect taxes. According to their logic, when taxes do not translate into quality government services, it is not worth paying them. Interviewees perceive spending on services, especially social policy programs, as highly political, and that is in line with the studies for political elites in Brazil and South Africa, for example, where these interviews also consider more efficient public services as the most important initiative in reducing inequality. Interviewees assume that their constituents share this perspective on taxes and that tax increases are politically unviable in Mexico. Thus, their opposition to raising taxes stems both from their personal viewpoint and from a belief that it would be unpopular among constituents. This negative view on government services contrasts with interviews' positive evaluation of established welfare states. And this is interesting because one notes Germany pays 50% in taxes, but look at Germany. If I had the highways they have in Germany, the services I wouldn't mind paying. So the argument underlying the expressions that I just shared with you are as common as they are flawed, because the demand for better spending before higher taxes contradicts a historical reality in which progressive taxes pay first for administrative needs and only then fund the type of public services that interviewees admire. Moreover, while the better spending first logic can point to a real concern over the issue of use of public resources, it can also be employed as an argument to hold off tax reform indefinitely, because better spending is subjective and interviews do not define what better means for them when they raise the concern. The view of taxation not as a choice but as part of a social contract and an obligation is a minority position. These interviewees believe that the government uses resources well, but that the problem that exists is so great that sadly there is not enough money. To address this deficit, they believe that a more progressive tax reform is needed, but they do not share a specific agenda to promote the issue. And notably, regardless of their perspective, interviewees do not consider themselves part of the government that they evaluate, and that echoes similar findings about Brazilian political elites as well. Accordingly, they convey no sense of being able to influence taxation. These are people that are officially in positions to do tax policy. When asked what influence they might have on the matter, they say that they could influence the public conversation around taxation or help improve productivity in their states. And 2 federal officials say that they could suggest changes in fiscal policy, but no one believes they have the power to significantly promote tax reform to reduce inequality. This chimes with their beliefs about the role of government and on reducing economic differences as central to the task of government. Where some believe that there should be a more expansive role in government, and states should ensure that people have access to services that help them leave poverty behind, and others, especially at the state level, seem to understand government more as tasked primarily with creating the conditions for private enterprise to do its thing. These interviews often believe that the main reform of the tax system should be simplification. The bureaucrats who most espouse this view of government came to public service from careers in the private sector, and they still speak of themselves as business people, often referring to their business activities in the present, who they plan to return to once they leave government. And given their continued self-understanding as business people and their close ties to the private sector, their ideas and priorities might be more similar to that sector of the population. Missing from all of these interviews is any expectation that Mexico should aim to build a welfare system reflecting their attenuated expectations of the state in a sense that in Mexico, comprehensive social protection is unviable, which supports theses suggesting that people's current context shapes their expectations from the state and the type of change that they can imagine. The perception that government makes bad use of resources means that interviewees prefer private services for themselves and for their children. So they use education, health, etc. on a private level. This means that public officials and politicians govern services they do not actually use themselves and they perceive as less desirable. They regard government-provided services as directed at them, the poor, as opposed to us. And redistribution is conceptualized as aiming at giving them quality of life so that they'll have streets, they'll have sidewalks, they'll have pavement, they'll have adequate housing. This way of speaking about the governed as other demonstrates the profound social distance between elites and the rest of the population. It suggests a misalignment of incentives because politicians govern a reality they do not experience and one which they do not prefer or they prefer to stay outside of. These findings are in line with others showing how politicians' personal histories or social status affects their policy making. A final finding is about, if not taxation, then what do these people actually want? The most common alternative to tax reform is improving the efficiency of public spending as a precondition to enacting more progressive taxation. Some even suggest that the additional revenue that this might produce would be enough to address the country's poverty and inequality. Similarly, greater enforcement of tax collection and an expansion of the tax base are mentioned as sufficient measures. And in addition, some state-level officials suggest that solutions to inequality may be found through the private sector and private-public partnerships, which again suggests that some suggest that, for instance, they could provide extensive private medical insurance for companies' employees instead of, for example, improving the public healthcare system. What do we conclude from these narratives? As I told you, we explored the paradox of political elites in Mexico not promoting fiscal redistribution despite this high inequality and the lack of public resources. We find that the reluctance towards fiscal redistribution does not arise from unrecognized inequality or from the belief in a meritocratic system as a current reality. Rather, it stems from a deep distrust in the government's ability to appropriately allocate revenue and from the economic status of political elites, aligning them closely with economic elites in their governmental relations. This skepticism about government, again, even among those within the state apparatus influencing tax policy, also underscores a shared viewpoint between political and economic elites, suggesting an overrepresentation of economic interests in tax policy making. Interviewees belong to the highest economic brackets, a status that allows them to opt out of public services in healthcare and education in favor of allegedly superior private alternatives. This ability distances political elites from the urgency of improving public systems, aligning their daily concerns more with those of other economic elites, and that's a misalignment that adversely affects the general population. Additionally, revolving doors between private enterprise and government roles carries forward business sector priorities that traditionally resist state intervention in Mexico. As interviews concentrate on addressing poverty, they often overlook the accumulation of wealth and its distorting effects. Most envision a state focused on alleviating poverty rather than altering the social structure. Elements of these discussions suggest that broad, high-quality public services are viewed as unrealistic for Mexico, and instead, the proposed role of the state is confined to targeted interventions that equalize opportunities. On a more abstract level, our findings suggest a broken social contract, which is why we called the book something about the new social contract, because believing that the state must earn the right to collect taxes indicates that interviewees do not see current government activity as sufficient. However, their focus on evaluating spending through government social programs also reveals that government activity is seen as highly politicized, highlighting the need for institutionalizing public bureaucracy. The evidence we have described indicates that support for redistribution cannot be assumed simply because of high inequality, even among those responsible for its implementation. to end on a less negative note, the situation is not entirely negative. Inequality has become a prominent issue in Mexico, so the discourse has changed with the discussion around progressive tax reform gaining more traction recently. And our interviewees do acknowledge a high level of inequality and show some support for increasing taxes on the wealthiest. Besides, Aurora already showed that there is support for some taxes amongst the general population as well. And these findings, we think, indicates potential for progress and suggest that those interested in advancing tax reform should seek innovative ways to bolster support. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And then our last presenter today is Jorge Atria. He's a professor at the Institute of Sociology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, an associate researcher in the Group and Individual Interactions line at the Center of Studies about Conflict and Social Cohesion, COES. He holds a PhD in sociology from Freie Universität Berlin, and his research areas include economic and fiscal sociology, elites and social stratification, and cultural sociology. Welcome, Jorge, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I will present some findings related to this research in which I analyze elite perceptions of taxation and redistribution. And I focus here on perceptions of redistribution, progressivity, and inheritance taxation. So I address particularly three research questions. First, what role does taxation have in the eyes of the economic elite? Second, to what extent do economic elites consent to the use of taxes to redistribute income and reduce inequality, and up to what level? And third, what are the arguments and repertoires that explain the positive or negative evaluation of inheritance taxation in countries with high and persistent economic inequality? And I focus on the case of Chile, which is typically considered one of the strongest states in Latin America. But however, Chile has a very high economic concentration and strong business power. The tax system in Chile has a regressive tax structure and low levels of wealth taxation. And wealth taxes in Chile are essentially inheritance tax and the property tax. And taxes have re-emerged as a highly conflictive issue in the last decades, particularly connected with social rights and inequality debates. And also Chile has experienced recently two tax reform processes. I would say it somehow failed, but this has provoked a huge debate. And also taxes are at the base of the growing perceptions of corruption in the public and private sectors linked to problems of avoidance and evasion. I use a perspective of fiscal sociology, which starts with a special definition of taxes as the obligation to contribute money or goods to the state in exchange for nothing in particular. So this is an emphasis and to make a distance with a concept of fee. So it's not a fee paid in direct exchange for a service, but rather an obligation to contribute that the state imposes on its citizens. And therefore, taxes are beyond a market logic and involves a sense of sacrifice connected to the nation or the community. And fiscal sociology attempts, starting from this definition, to analyze taxes as both a symptom and a cause of large-scale changes in the economy and society, and therefore there are many studies analyzing the role of taxation in terms of financing wars, welfare policies, and how the social meaning of taxes can have different outcomes in terms of social outcomes and tax reforms. Taxes are also one of the main instruments for putting an ideal of distributive justice into practice, and also taxes are one of the few spheres where it's possible to inquire the relationship between the economic elite and the state. We have lots of information concerning social policy, housing, salaries, but normally we don't have many information to understand the relationship between individuals and state concerning the economic elite. So taxes are one of these possibilities. When we analyze the literature concerning redistribution, progressivity, and wealth taxation, We can find several works, and I would say one cannot just assume that all elites oppose taxes. And variation is explained typically by fear, high perceptions of inequality of opportunity, greater economic strain, political awareness, and perceptions of growing inequality, among other aspects. There are also some empirical studies that show that countries with larger welfare states support higher spending on social policies than countries with weak welfare states. And elite preference for tax progressivity appear for some authors more heterogeneous than preference for redistribution and wealth taxes, which relate to fairness considerations. Countries in the global south tend to be less supportive of a rising tax rate, which is associated with a refusal to increase government revenues. And specifically regarding inheritance taxes, there is a very high opposition, I would say, at global level, but different influence of three domains. So purely individual preference, opposing tax inheritance, the social influence of the family as a decision to intergenerational transmission of privilege, or community in general, that is more societal considerations, institutional solidarity. Regarding perceptions of the state, in general, Latin American business elites tend to distrust in state institutions. And I take here the work by Gabriel Ondetti, and he argues that in Latin America, there are some countries like Chile, Mexico, and Guatemala, which have experienced historical events that threatened private property, and that this led to strong anti-statist coalitions, blocking tax reforms that increase the tax burden, unlike other group of countries such as Argentina, Brazil, or Ecuador. So key to this argument is the understanding of different actors ideologically, which underscores the formation of preference. This is what Ondetti called an anti-statist sentiment, and helps explain difference in terms of organization and exertion of influence. But it's not clear in that work what kind of attitudes can be qualified as anti-statist, and how these attitudes shed light on the perceptions of taxation and redistribution. So in sum, considering the long-term processes of inequality and wealth accumulation, the willingness of wealthy elites to pay taxes is particularly important because their ideology impacts tax collection and the tax system design. And one could also say that high anti-statism could motivate higher tax avoidance than low anti-statism. As I already said, Chile has very high income concentration levels, particularly in the top 1%, even if we compare with other Latin American countries. And we also know that this is a historical trend, using tax data and the methodology by Alvareo, Atkinson, Piketty, and co-authors. And these levels of income concentration are relatively high, at least the last 50 or 60 years. And we also know that the Chile tax to GDP ratio is low compared with other OECD countries when they had similar GDP per capita to Chile's current level. So the current level of Chile GDP per capita is around the tax burden is around 20%. And as you can see, this is lower than the tax burden that all OECD countries had when they had the same GDP per capita. So my methodology was based on in-depth interviews with the political elite, the scientific elite, tax advisors, and the economic elite. And here I'm just presenting results concerning economic elites. And in this group, I conducted 32 interviews, and I combined two criteria, high positions and high incomes. The average income per capita of the sample is located slightly below the 99th percentile. 12 out of 32 interviews are board members or owners of companies, 13 are managers, and 3 are independent consultants or directors of business foundations or business associations. Most of them work in large or middle-sized companies or organizations, and the rest in expert consultancy or management of business foundations. And I use a strategy of interview guidelines using two levels: general questions, the role of taxes, the importance of the government, as well as concrete questions, evaluations of VAT, income tax, inheritance tax, and tax expenditures. So I present here some results. First, regarding redistribution, and for most of my interviews, state redistribution appears as a very ineffective policy due to two main reasons. First, it appears as a paternalistic policy, which means especially the squandering of resources. And also, a second reason is it's viewed as an ideological tool. And here some participants mentioned that redistribution is like a Robin Hood strategy of just taking from the rich to give to the poor. There is a strong reaction of state growth, which is associated with perceptions of corruption and incompetence. And therefore, the priority in taxation should be especially efficiency, neutrality, and the non-distortion on private decisions. And what is the desired public expenditure in this size of the state? Essentially two elements: education and productive development to favor equality of opportunities, and also entrepreneurship initiatives. Unlike other Latin American countries, in Chile, unwillingness of the elite to further redistribution by the state coexists with a social consciousness to address main social issues. But what are the alternatives to the role of state if elites oppose redistribution? First, growth appears as the state's main social policy. And second, what I call an individual redistribution, which is channeled throughout foundations and Christian charity. So for some participants, donations and foundations cannot complement, but even replace the role of state. And I have here some quotations. Regarding progressivity and regressivity, probably the font is too small. I present here three repertoires of evaluation. Repertoires is a classical category that we use in sociology to organize arguments. And there are three main repertoires concerning progressivity and regressivity. The first repertoire is an unconditional support for progressive taxation. And this relies essentially on one argument, which is the first one: those who earn more should pay more than those who earn less. Then several arguments are displayed, and they are grouped in this repertoire, this skepticism towards progressivity. And this is the kind of arguments: tax income works regressively and not progressively because of exemptions and tactics used to pay less. Income tax is not much help since the richest transfer costs to the rest, and the middle class is the most affected by the payment, etc. And the third repertoire is a repertoire of resignation and tolerance towards regressivity. And here is this argument. The first argument is the most used in my sample regarding VAT. VAT is unfair, regressive, or it is a large burden on the poorest, and rather it's high in our system, though it is efficient and necessary. And other arguments in this repertoire: a good alternative to income tax could be a flat tax, or the minor argument: those who earn more should pay less than those who earn less. Regarding inheritance taxation, a minority group of participants consider this tax a fair one with solid justification. And they mobilize essentially two arguments. First, it is one of the few opportunities in society to tax extreme wealth. As a consequence, it reduces income disparities. And the second argument, it prevents wealth from reproducing undeservedly when controlling heirs' patrimonial growth. Consequence, it facilitates meritocracy. Contrarily, when we look at negative evaluations, we also found several different arguments, which I grouped into three repertoires. The first repertoire, the inheritance tax is inefficient and ineffective. And some arguments: richest people do not pay it because they perform tax planning. Consequence, it's ineffective. It collects too little, it's inefficient. It produces a planning industry, it's inefficient, and it does not add value. The second repertoire, this tax does not have a clear justification. And this is quite striking since it goes against all the literature that argues that the inheritance tax is precisely a modern tax designed to prevent or block the intergenerational transmission of privilege. Some arguments, this tax belongs to the past and there is no point in using it nowadays. Consequence, there is no basis for it. There's a natural wish to leave resources for the children to have a better future. This is unnatural. Or the heir did not buy anything at all. He just received a type of gift. Consequence, inheritance should not be subject to taxation. And the third repertoire emphasizes the economic shortcomings. For instance, this tax destroys small and family businesses, rates are too high, or it damages the middle class because they cannot perform tax planning. So consequence, destroys value, discourages and disturbs entrepreneurial activity, or it is regressive. So to conclude, 3 slides to promote the discussion. My findings show somehow a divide between the role of state and the role of private entrepreneurship, where the role of states means, above all, wealth destruction, and the role of private entrepreneurship means wealth creation. There is a strong distrust of the state across the arguments, across the issues, as well as unwillingness to pay more taxes and a self-proclaimed vocation to lead the economy. Regarding this individual solidarity and the decentralization of redistribution, I think here there is a potential contribution to understand the anti-statism sentiment in Chile, but this should be compared to anti-statism sentiments in other countries. This means here in Chile, I think, reduction of problems and bias of fiscal redistribution, more efficiency and more resources where the state is not doing it well, restoration of taxpayers' freedom, in line, I would say, with recent philosophical theories, the priority of donors' purposes, especially in this case in Chile, opportunities and education for entrepreneurship, the enhancement of the sense of social responsibility, and finally, the expression of ethical coherence and/or religious glorification. Regarding perceptions of inheritance and state, it is pretty clear that the individual and his economic interest and the interest of the family predominate over social interest. The literature shows that there is opposition to inheritance tax too in middle and lower classes. However, elites promote discourses of merit and opportunity to describe their trajectories of innovation and success, and therefore the defense of inherited wealth becomes compatible with ideas of meritocracy. In this frame, income concentration and reproduction of privilege do not seem to be a problem, and negative views of the state and antipathy toward taxation appear more important than awareness of inequality. And as such, solidarity with the less fortunate appear as a matter of private rather than public concern. And I would also mention that the economic elites mobilize not only economic aspects, so philosophical, political, and legal arguments discredit the benefits and deny the principles that gave rise to the inheritance tax in modern societies. So to conclude, in recent years, the last decade in particular, the strong emergence of social movements and inclusion of taxation in the demands for redistribution have forced right and left governments to propose reforms after 3 decades without profound transformations in Chile. However, neoliberal reforms have accentuated, intensified an anti-state sentiment, but in general, not only among the elite. And this is also important since prevents tax rates from being raised beyond the super rich in context of tax reform public debates. So this makes the challenge to think about different tax culture to promote taxation or tax fairness, not only regarding the elite, but also the general population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. Before I open the floor for questions, let me just make a quick comment. We decided to propose this invited session to address some of the cultural barriers that are very real, but economists, we usually don't pay too much attention to them. As Leopoldo, who is our partner from Uniades, in this initiative, and this session, we have heard about attitudes, preferences, perceptions, and we have heard of these factors not only for the general population, like when people react to accents in general, or just like Aurora was saying, like the general population, how they think about redistribution and inequality, and what's their preferences for tax redistribution, but also elites, right? These are, be it in the general population, these attitudes, preferences, perceptions are be in the normal population or in elites. These are like real barriers to social mobility and redistribution in the region. So that's why we wanted to again promote this interdisciplinary discussion between economists and sociologists. I'm an economist, so we also want to learn a lot from people who have already been studying these things by far more time. So with that, I open the floor to you. Whether you have questions, comments, please raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Thank you all for a very interesting set of presentations. I learned a lot and I had a lot of questions. So I wanted to read the paper and the book. But for now, I have just a couple for Leopoldo and for Alice. So one thing that kind of struck me during the presentation of your results, Leopoldo, is that you indicate that the results are, due to the characterization of Bogota, we cannot attribute those results to a racial divide due to the correlation between socioeconomic status and race in the city. What I was thinking is you explore if there is an association by the people responding to the experiment of who do they envision when they hear the high-class accent. If they're envisioning a dark-skinned Colombian, Raizal Colombian, who is like the people who have in mind when they are hearing that voice? Because I think that although we here like to disentangle the effects, that for the people who are responding to the treatment, they are implicitly imposing a set of assumptions on who they are hearing. So I think it will be interesting to also test those set of assumptions. And for Alice is a question about if you asked about how they, for the respondents of the questionnaires, how do they perceive their social mobility trajectory? Because they might perceive themselves to be right now like middle class or top middle class. And I don't know who was the guy who answered low class, because that person is clearly out of this world. Because I think that kind of would explain the formation of their preferences and the role that they see themselves playing as members of the bureaucracy. If they feel like, well, the state never helped me in my trajectory and everything is due to my effort, then there is no reason for me to actually, even when I am a member of the state, to pursue redistributive policies. Because in my experience doesn't account for that result. So I was wondering if you have something to say on that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that question. So I had one slide which I skipped just for time to make the point that in Bogota, at least, when you look at the surveys, there's clearly no strong correlation between the race and the socioeconomic variables to capture socioeconomic status. That makes us believe that it is unlikely that the whole effect of your interpretation comes from race. Now, I cannot rule out what you're saying, and my statement does not deny that there is also racism in Bogota, which certainly there is. And therefore, since people used to typically see this in bundles, it is likely that if I ask them who they envision, they might envision somebody with darker skin if they listen to the low-class accent than the high-class accent. So that's as far as much as I can say, is that, given the correlation between race and socioeconomic status in Bogota, it is unlikely that this is completely driven by race, but that doesn't at all can contradict the existence of racism, which has been documented for some colleagues of mine in the context of Bogota and in other contexts in Colombia even stronger, and that it might be the case that if I did the experiment that you propose, then people would, bundle up all the things that they associate with not so much a status, and among them, racist perceptions of the people would come up. I would expect that would be the case, actually.
Thank you, Luis Angel. I think you asked me a trick question there. If I have something to say about this, is my main topic, so I'll keep it to two comments. Yes, we asked people about their own social mobility. We don't have histories of their life, and we didn't do any biographical checkups, but we do know that some of these people experienced social mobility themselves. But that's one of the main points, that their own background affects the role that they should play. I mean, in parentheses, of course, experience is not the only thing. I mean, there's information, right? We're scientists. We think that information does something even though we don't experience it personally. But we expect from a public official that they can disentangle to some degree, I mean, that's our idealistic expectations, their own experience from whatever they are supposed to legislate or to execute, right? But additionally, the literature has contradictory results on whether the personal experience of social mobility actually increases or decreases preferences for redistribution. I mean, there are studies that certify both directions, right? But what I think is important in our context is that the experience of politicians, of professional politicians in this country and probably others in the region is very similar to what Jorge presented. If you realize the arguments are very similar to economic elites. And the reason is not coincidence. The reason is because they are economic elites, right? So the fact that we cannot separate these two clearly means, analytically, it's not always useful for us as elite scholars, elite studies scholars, to analytically separate elites into categories, because they are often the same people, especially in this region. And it also says something about the motivations that they have for implementing or not certain policies. And this is really important, I think, to understand why there is no fiscal redistribution or proper in this country recently, right? Because it has a lot to do with the personal backgrounds of people. And this is something that we have to look into. And interestingly, last comment, these interviews are with people from the Morena government. These are not before the transition, right? So we expected that there would be like this shift, that now people would be a lot more open about this. And it turns out somewhat, but not as much as we would have expected theoretically, right? So it's not very clear why, from theoretical standpoints or ideological, even personally, what most explains this is a personal experience that is completely different from what you would expect in this trajectory or in this position.
Following the order of raising hands, over here, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentation, super interesting. I have two questions, one for Leopoldo. Is it possible to also disentangle the premium or for accents, but in Colombia? Because my guess is that goes beyond gomelos or ñeros, it goes also across regions. So is there anything to say about it? And also if you can, after having all these mechanisms where you basically provide a proof of concept that this exists, can you quantify in a model how much this matter compared to income or education, some other stuff? And a question to Alice and Jorge, after hearing your presentations, I'm just curious to know if there's an aggregate database or supra study of how these elites work in Latin America to try to make, comparatives between countries, right? And try to understand how these mechanisms somehow lead to some type of reforms, or to some types of taxation. I think that that comparison would be super interesting. But thanks for.
Thank you very much. So these are the two very good questions. In terms of regions, actually, our original design we had Bogotanos ranking Paisas, people from Medellin and close areas, and Bogotanos ranking Chileans. And it turned out that Bogotanos were pretty good at ranking the social class of people from Medellin. So our initial idea was, let's take someone who's really close culturally, an intermediate one and a distant one. And, upon reflection, when we did this in the piloting, the thing is that Paisa culture is all over the place. So you have been probably exposed to Paisa culture. You have probably seen a narco telenovela or something which features some Paisa guy and which features the high class of the Paisa society and the low class of the Paisa society. So that didn't work that well, and that's the reason we abandoned the regional aspect in our design. And also because we were focusing on the high versus low class, like the socioeconomic variation. Now, putting that aside, I'm pretty sure, and there's a lot of interesting work. There's no of this sort that I'm aware of, like experimental type of work, discussing the regional biases within Colombia, and they are pretty huge. So, for instance, there's a lot of work on how people from Bogota, how we tend to view people from the coast. And so there are all these prejudices about them being lazy or corrupt and so forth. So I would expect big effects on the accents, not only along the socioeconomic dimension, but also along the regional dimension. And on your second point on how much this matters, so there are two questions to that. So first, I didn't do kind of the size calculation comparisons with the average marginal component effects, because it is a bit tricky when you have attributes that don't have the same number of levels. So in accents, we only have low and high class accent, but in education, we had like 7 levels. So that implies that you cannot do exactly the naive comparison of saying like moving from a low class to a high accent implies 5 percentage point increase in preference towards that person that looks like something similar to moving from only primary to having a postgraduate degree, but the calculation implies a bit more than that. So that's the reason I didn't put it out there, but they are pretty big. So once you do the correct calculations, it actually comes out to being able to increase 2 or 3 steps in education levels, or 2 or 3 steps in the income levels that are typically used in the household service in Colombia. So this is something that is really sizable. Now, someone could come back at me and say, well, yeah, but that's only a survey. So perhaps, that's how it matters for attitudes, but are we sure that that matters in the same degree for then consequential decisions, such as, actually giving the job to someone or not? And that's, I think, a fair point. There are several advantages with using the survey that I already mentioned, but to be able to test whether this matters in an actual market, I'm actually now working on a similar experiment with requests from high class and low class voice notes of people sending requests to see apartments for rent in Bogota. And our expectation there is that there's going to be, especially in some parts of the city, pretty strong discrimination in a not only sizable in the terms of the magnitude of the coefficient, but really consequential decision in a market. Yeah.
Just quickly, I'll let Jorge answer this, but you're in luck, my friend, because Jorge and I are working on a comparative elite thing for Latin America, but it's not there yet, but it will come.
Just to give more ideas, I would say there is no work or no database which completely address these issues and compare elites. But for instance, I would mention the OECD, for instance, is doing a new survey on tax culture, and they include countries from the 5 continents. So I think this is very interesting, and they have attitudes, practices. So I think this is very interesting and should come in 2025. There is also this elite quality index, which compares the quality of elites. But I would say this is somehow normative, and it's not very clear. We have made in Chile, for instance, the National Survey of Elites. And we conducted surveys with economic elites, political elites, and cultural elites. So we can not just compare. It's not possible, of course, to compare between countries, but we can compare between elites So this is also interesting to show the heterogeneous preference of elites, for instance, and the distance with the citizenship. And I would also mention the World Elites database. I think this is the newest thing. And there are 3 or 4 countries in Latin America, and the World Elites database attempts to compare the characteristics of elites, gender, age, and positions, social background. But this, of course, is just the first step, and it's not enough to compare social issues. But World Elites database already has a website, and yeah, there are works coming soon.
Thank you. More questions? Following the order, I think here, then over there, and then let's see if we have time for the very last 2.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question to Leopoldo Ferguson. And I would like to know more about the classification in low income ascent and high income, because I'm from Colombia, and I think that maybe there are many within variations, especially in low income ascents, because you can find someone in that category with actually ECINEQ, who have a very particular ascent, and there are many people and many different, but you also can find someone from, I don't know, maybe administrative, working class or something like that, in low level that is also a low income class, but maybe their ascent are very different. So I will know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure, that's a good point. So I oversimplified here, and I said that, we just looked for actors that could make an accent that would be believably high class and believably low class. But of course, within the high classes and within the low classes, there's a lot of variation. When we were choosing different countries, for instance, we tried at some point to do a comparison, not with Chile, but with Argentina. And there's at least 2 in our discussion with the Argentine actors, so much different versions of the high class Argentine accent by generation or area of the city where you live and so forth, that we couldn't come up with it. So yes, this is a simplification. We took a stereotypical high class accent and a stereotypical low class accent, and that's the one we piloted. Now, with one caveat, it was stereotypical, it was clear, but it was not comical. It was not hyperbolic, which is important to say because, recently in Colombia, and I suppose in other Latin American countries as well, we have influencers and actors and comedians doing a lot of, I think, fantastic work of ridiculizing these accents and showing, perhaps more tellingly than any paper that I can write, how these are barriers to interaction, mobility, and are full with perceptions and biases. So that's what we aim for, something that was believable, one version of the high-class accent, one version of the low-class accent, but without falling into the hyperbole. That was essentially what we did, yeah.
And what was the difference between low-class and high-class? Because you can find someone high-class more close, I don't know.
Yeah. So as judged by the people in our pilot, whenever you heard the high-class accent instead of the low-class accent, you would increase the chance of that voice being associated with a high-class person by 20 percentage points. And those 20 percentage points is like a 50% increase in the probability of assigning someone to a high-class accent. So, this, in the end, is a subjective kind of assessment, but our piloting revealed that, on average, we were able to create 2 sets of accents that were believably more high class and low class. Yeah.
Would I be politically incorrect in asking if the accent would be associated to a proper way of using the language or command of language? That is, say in England, receive pronunciation, as you mentioned, it's immediately associated with high class, but it's also immediately associated with a good command of English, right? So in terms of, say, policy, right? If that's a barrier, now you have, for example, in Mexico, textbooks for children, teaching them that you can say aiga, you can say vistes, and that's perfectly correct. And you have very solid arguments from linguistics saying it's proper English. I agree with them, right? After all, Latin, Spanish is a bad command of Latin, right? But in terms of policy, right? So in your analysis or your empirical work, it's, for me, it will be difficult to understand if it's really easy to dissociate, right? The accent from the command of the language, and if that is important. Can you have a, say, similar kind of experiment, having a high-class accent, speaking on convention, something that's associated to bad command of language, and if that's a barrier, right? Would you hire an engineer who speaks badly but has a high accent, a good high-class accent, right? This kind of mixing the effect. I mean, can you really dissociate the effect, right? It's just a question.
No, I think this is not politically correct, or if it is, we should still talk about it. And it is politically relevant. So in terms of our design, we were careful to force actors to use the same words and even the same enunciation. So to use the correct one. So for instance, in different classes, it could be that some words in Spanish, at least in Bogota, are spoken differently, and there's one that is correct. So someone may, for example, I'm going to give a concrete example that's maybe politically correct, but someone may say concepto instead of concepto, even though they know how to write it down, but they would say concepto. That's how they used to listen to it in their home or whatever. So we avoided that, precisely for the concern that you said, because it could convey command of the language rather than merely the pronunciation. Now, that is something that we could do in our experiment because we had everything controlled and it was a short enough description that it would be believable that even though you are low class, you didn't recur to some of these quote-unquote incorrect pronunciations or incorrect command of the language. We didn't do that experimental variation that we are suggesting, which could be super interesting, which is how much of this comes from the incorrect use of the language as dictated by the, Real Academia Española or whoever, or Instituto Caro y Cuervo in Colombia, and how much from the accent. Now, in terms of the policy implications, which is the other thing that you were saying, that's the second part of your question, which I think one should unpack, and that's a really harder question, which is, at some level, this shows that if you are lower class and can speak differently, then there's something to gain from that. But at the same time, that's not only paternalistic, but that's maybe impossible for some, but that also entails some trade-offs. Maybe if I start speaking differently, then I become more accepted in certain circles to get a job, but I become less accepted in my circles, which I care about and which are important for so many reasons. So in terms of policy, this is a really interesting and rich and difficult discussion. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you all for the presentation. I have a question for Leopoldo. You, in one of the estimation, mentioned that you made an interaction with being from a low socioeconomic class. And I want to ask you if you try to make that interaction with the gender, because maybe women and men could have like different preferences or value differently, having a friend or a shop or a co-worker that is from their same socioeconomic level. And I want to ask you if you tried that interaction or not.
Yeah, we did. We didn't focus on it for the analysis because it was not part of our focus in the pre-analysis plan. So to be completely transparent that these were the focus and so on. But we find two things. We find A, that people prefer women in many of these things. They prefer them as friends, as co-workers. And so there's not a gender bias. There's a gender premium in our experiment for many of these things. And if I recall correctly, the accent effect is more or less similar. It's a bit different in one of the sexes, I don't remember. And I should say we just have sex. Women, we don't have anything more sophisticated than that. So there are some interesting things and like food for thought, but we didn't emphasize it just because it wasn't part of the things that we committed to look into in detail. Yeah, but I agree that it's an interesting thing. Yeah.
The very last question in the back. Is there still a question? You? Okay. Very last one, please.
Thank you. It's a question or comment to Jorge. I was very interested about your research. You mentioned that tax is something that you pay for, but then you don't have something in return, exactly. But what about if you change this? Because for inheritance taxation, maybe people will be more willing to support this if you offer them that you will do something else with this revenue. So we ran an experiment in Luxembourg, and we manipulate the use of revenues from a new inheritance taxation. And when we mentioned that we will use this for basic education, people agree with this. But when we say that we will use for poverty, yes, general poverty, they even were against this. So, and then we didn't say any information, so it has no effects. But maybe, I don't know if you, in your interviews, you deal with this or not? Thank you.
Thank you. It is actually right. In Chile, it's the same. So I would say this is the definition of fiscal sociology, and a part of the interest of the definition is to show that taxation is not a fee, and when you pay, you are part of a web of reciprocity. So this is the concept in terms of the theory. So when you pay taxes, you are expecting that in the future, when you need the money or you need assistance or health, you will find help for the state. And this is the I would say, part of the ideas that give rise to the welfare states, the idea of institutionalization of solidarity. But in practice, in context of reforms, not only in Chile, but in general, this is the issue of earmarking money. And in case of taxes, of course, this occurs, and I know very well the recent process of tax reform, and part of the negotiation was exactly what about educational reform or the pension reform, and this costs X, and therefore we need a tax reform to increase tax rates. But I would say, okay, this occurs in practice, but it risks that if you don't see the effect of this educational or pension reform, then you say, okay, then I don't pay anything more. So this is the constant discussion in the literature, in fiscal sociology. So you can earmark or have a conversation in which you promise that the money will be used very successfully and for essential needs, but you can just risk that it's completely dedicated to this issue, education or pension, because in the future, if something fails, then you don't have any negotiation. So I think it's important to understand that taxation are more than just to receive something in return, and this is part of the debate, I would say.
Well, in the interest of lunch, we have to finish now. We thank all of our speakers. This was really interesting. Please follow us in social media. There's Uniades, and then there's PRAEM-Colmex. We will be fostering all these kind of discussions and research and work. Thank you very much for coming, and have a good lunch.